I've never been to Death Valley, but I am very familiar with it. Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is another book club video where I'm reviewing the books that I've been reading recently. And for those of you that are new here, my name is Alexis and I am a PhD student living in Oahu, Hawaii. Today we're diving into a book called Death Valley by Melissa Broder. It came out in 2023 and my sister Lydia bought it for me for Christmas last year, so I thought I would give it a read. And being someone from LA that loves the desert, I was like instantly drawn to this book or interested in reading this book. I've never been to Death Valley, but I am very familiar with it. And I was curious to see why the author chose to title her book after this place in the desert. So I don't typically read that many fiction books, so I didn't really know what to expect before reading this book, but I really enjoyed it. I thought it was super strange and captivating, so I wanted to share some of my thoughts about this book with you all. So Death Valley would fall under the genre of magical realism or humorous fiction. It's a strange and almost surreal story that is taking place in one of the harshest places in the US, Death Valley, which is just super hot, dry, and like deserted. And the narrative is following this unnamed protagonist who is taking a journey through the desert and experiencing these bizarre and often unsettling hallucinations. And this book also blurs the line between reality and imagination, so while you're reading it, you're sometimes unsure whether what she's describing is actually happening in real life or if it's just something happening in her mind and her imagination. So as the story unfolds, you're kind of left to wonder whether the protagonist is suffering from like heat exhaustion or if she like took peyote and mushrooms during her time in the desert and is experiencing hallucinations, or if she is just experiencing something completely different, something more like mental and emotional. So the main themes that Death Valley is exploring are grief, isolation, and perception. And the deserted Death Valley does a really good job of amplifying these themes, as the empty and like harsh landscape that she's going through mirrors her own inner world and like inner turmoil that she's experiencing. So it's a really fascinating story of how we deal with extreme conditions, both physically and internally, like mentally and emotionally, how we cope with these things. And the author does an excellent job of describing the emotional isolation that the protagonist is feeling while she's out there in the desert, and also highlighting the distortion of reality that oftentimes comes with grief. So the main character, the protagonist of the story, is unnamed, but we learn that she is a woman with a father that's sick in the hospital, close to death, and a husband that is also chronically ill. So we know that she is struggling with grief, and she goes out in the desert to kind of seek something else, seek some relief from all of this grief, and to self-reflect and kind of escape this emotional burden that she's feeling, or kind of running away from it, but trying to like process and face it at the same time. And the character's strange experiences are what's moving the plot forward or driving the plot. So it's mostly about all of these weird encounters that she's having, these bizarre things that she's experiencing, but there's not that much in terms of like character development within herself. There is a little bit, but I think it's a little bit lacking. And again, in terms of character, there's not too many other characters involved other than the protagonist and maybe the cactus, which is an important character in the story, I think. But yeah, we never know if this cactus is real or if it's just all a part of her imagination, just a product of the protagonist's mind as she's in this very emotional, like chaotic state. I think this plot is super disorienting, which makes it so engaging and kept me reading to figure out what happens next. I never knew what to expect, and while reading it, I can like best summarize it as a fever dream. It just feels crazy and like impossible, and these things cannot be really happening. So yeah, all of these hallucinations and strange occurrences really keep you like questioning what is real and what is just in the reader's mind. So it's very chaotic, but I think this is in a good way because it keeps you wanting to read to kind of find out what happens next. And I think the writing style isn't anything too special, or nothing really jumps out at me about the writing style. But I do know that her storytelling is pretty good, and she gives you like good visual descriptions of what she's seeing. So all of these hallucinations feel very real as she's describing them. She's able to create this like atmosphere that feels very like psychedelic or trippy. And I think this book really immerses you in what the protagonist is going through as she's in the desert, exploring externally and also internally. So yeah, all of that is great, even though the writing isn't particularly special in any way. I think my favorite part about this book was just the weirdness and the strangeness of it all. It feels very like uneasy, uncomfortable as she's describing some of these things, which is weird that it was my favorite, but I think it just kept me like on my toes. I never really knew what to expect. Yeah, I had to do a lot of thinking myself to like interpret what was actually happening in the book and what was real versus what was just a product of the protagonist's mind and her like mental state. So yeah, all of this felt like a bit of a puzzle to me, which made it fun to read and one of my favorite parts. My least favorite part about the book was maybe the character development, because she's kind of the main character, but we don't learn too much about her. You learn a little bit about what she's going through and what she's struggling with, but then the book kind of just ends and it feels a little incomplete. Like you don't get a nice feeling of like satisfaction or relief when you're done with it. It kind of just ends, and maybe that's okay, because maybe that's what real life is just like sometimes. Like you don't always have closure, or yeah, you don't always know everything about a person, and maybe that is what you're supposed to take from this book. But yeah, I just felt like the character development kind of wasn't there, in addition to like the other characters in the book. They're just kind of briefly mentioned, but not really anyone that you would relate to that much, maybe. So as I mentioned, I don't typically read much of this genre or fiction in general, so I don't have very good book recommendations of what you might want to check out if you like this one. But I did want to mention that the like confusingness and dreamlike states that she's experiencing kind of reminded me of the movie Inception, which is very hard to understand. Sometimes you have to watch it a few times to understand, okay, what's really happening in the dream world, what's happening in real life. It keeps you guessing and leaves a little bit up to interpretation as well. And that's what this book really reminded me of, and probably why I liked it, because I really loved the movie Inception and I really enjoyed this very strange book. Okay, so who else might enjoy this book? I think you might enjoy this book if you're into surreal, mind-bending reads that explore emotional and mental states. Then this book could be a great read for you. And it's definitely for readers that don't mind not having all of the answers to something when you're done reading. There are some loose ends that you kind of just have to like figure out for yourself, or yeah, just reflect on a bit for yourself. Maybe reread it if you want, if something was really confusing, or I don't know, if you just want to have a second look at what happened. So yes, I really enjoyed this book. I read it very quickly because, as I mentioned, it was just so strange. So I just kept turning the pages and like really confused, going to my partner like, you'll never believe what just happened. Like, trust me, you'll never believe what just happened. She just did this. And it's just wild. And just, yeah, wondering what was real, what was not. It felt like being in a fever dream and also trying to interpret someone's fever dream. So yeah, very bizarre, very strange, but I think all of these components of the book made it like stick with me and made it so memorable to me. That is why I'm recommending it to you guys. And I also think this book is very relatable because the protagonist is experiencing some grief and dealing with these very difficult like family and partner relationships that she just doesn't know how to navigate, and she's kind of trying to escape out into the desert landscape to kind of find some peace of mind and, I don't know, just take a moment to reflect on everything that is happening and to just find some relief being alone in the desert. But it turns into something like pretty scary, pretty confusing very quickly. So yeah, I think her journey can be very relatable to other people's journeys that we experience in our own lives. Oh, she also mentions that she's staying in a Best Western, and as someone that has taken many trips out to the desert in California as well as Arizona, I always stayed at Best Westerns with my family, so her descriptions of these places are very accurate and it makes it feel very familiar, and it kind of got me to chuckle about the things that she's mentioning because I'm just like, wow, this is exactly how I felt when I was in a Best Western in the middle of the desert. So those like very accurate details, I think, overall benefit the book and made it very relatable to me. So overall, I'd give this book a 4 out of 5. I thought it was a very great read, very entertaining, intriguing, bizarre, and strange. But I think all of these like weird components of it are exactly what made it very memorable and very enjoyable for me to read. So although she doesn't go into too much detail, like breaking down the different characters in the book, there's not too many other characters, I think she makes up for that by creating this very like unique, trippy, psychedelic atmosphere that the protagonist is experiencing. So what did you think? Have you read this book, Death Valley? If not, does it sound like something you'd enjoy? Let me know down in the comments. Also, if you're into odd, introspective books, then you might be interested in reading Why Fish Don't Exist. I think it's by Lulu Miller, but I did a review of this book also on my channel, so go check that out right after, and maybe you'll enjoy that one too. Please don't forget to like this video if you got any value out of it. I really appreciate it, and subscribe to not miss any future book club videos. Thank you, happy holidays, and enjoy your reading.